Welcome, everyone. I'll call this meeting to order, Senate Government Organization. Clerk will take a silent roll call to establish quorum. Quorum being determined, first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from March 27th, 2021 meeting. I recognize the Vice Chair for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the minutes of March 27, 2021 meeting.
The question is on the motion that the minutes be approved. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. And the ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. I declare the motion adopted. First bill on the agenda is House Bill 2694. Council Childs, will you please explain the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of this committee, you have before you for consideration House Bill 2969, which is unchanged from the engrossed House version at this time. This bill creates a new article in the criminal law known as the Second Amendment Preservation Act. The new article begins with legislative findings touting the importance of both the Second Amendment as well as the principles of federalism. To that end, Section 3 of the new article contains a list of prohibitions for state agencies, political subdivisions, or employees thereof, which generally forbids any active engagement against citizens regarding federal gun charges and any cooperation with federal law enforcement in furtherance of its engagement against federal gun crime. There are exceptions in subsection B of Section 3, but only so long as the primary purpose of any federal cooperation is a focus on some crime other than federal gun laws. The bill also states that the Attorney General, beginning January 1st, 2022, and updated as deemed necessary, publish model policies which will guide agencies and political subdivisions on limiting assistance with federal law enforcement regarding gun laws. Finally, the bill contains a severability clause. There is a second reference to this to the Committee on Judiciary and no fiscal note with this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to answer any questions of council.
Thank you, Philip. Questions of council? Junior Senator from the 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Childs, and I don't know this because I don't have a background in law enforcement, but I would imagine both local, state, and federal law enforcement work together on a whole range of issues and coordinate together. I mean, is that your understanding as well?
Without testifying, that is my understanding. There are some members representing law enforcement here today that could answer that with more specificity.
Sure. I mean, I guess my major one of my concerns with this bill is, even if you believe in the merit of the bill, I'd worry about unraveling those, not those organizations, but the coordination between those agencies in order to defend the public, protect the public, and provide service to the public. But I guess I'll ask someone at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Childs.
Thank you. Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Philip, who drafted this legislation?
Actually, I do not know that, Senator.
You don't know who wrote it?
No.
You know if it was a member of the legislative staff, either here or in the House?
I couldn't answer that. Don't know one way or the other.
Can you give us an example of a federal government commandeering state or local officers to carry out federal executive orders?
I cannot.
Can you explain for us how state participation in federal law enforcement programs conflict with the West Virginia Constitution?
I cannot, but again, there are members here representing law enforcement who I believe could answer these.
Phil, with all due respect, you're the attorney, and there's a finding in this bill that says that there's a conflict with the West Virginia Constitution. I'm not going to ask those police officers that question. I'm asking you that question.
I would be happy to do further research on that, but to my knowledge, I don't know what that conflict would entail.
Again, looking at the findings, how does state involvement in a federal law enforcement program raise the possibility that someone could be targeted based upon politics?
I don't know the answer to that.
Can you give us an example of someone being detained in violation of the Second Amendment?
I cannot.
Okay. Finally, and this might be a couple of questions for you, but in my reading of this bill, it appears that a key part to it is an attempt to differentiate between gun laws that we have on the books in West Virginia and whether or not there's a correlating federal gun law passed by Congress. And from what I read in this bill, if there's a law that does not exist under the laws of West Virginia or is not substantially similar to a law on the books in West Virginia, then our local and state officials won't be able to help with a federal law enforcement program. So first off, do you understand that to be part of this legislation we're considering?
That would be my interpretation, that if we don't have a law specifically tailored to something that the federal government does regarding firearms and firearm safety, then yes, we will not be able to coordinate with federal support.
Okay. So my follow-up question is this. Can you give us examples of federal gun laws that don't have a correlating state law?
I believe there are certain things, what would come to mind are things like, I guess in recent times, like the bump stocks or the sear clips that turn them automatic. I know we don't have a law on the books in West Virginia that specifically outlaws those attachments, I guess you'd say, whereas there are, to my knowledge, federal laws to that end.
Okay. Is there anything else that you can think of where there's not a correlating?
That's all that comes to mind. I'm sure there's more.
Okay. Do you know if there is a state law related to what some in law enforcement call a lie-in-buy? And in other words, that's when somebody fills out the form when you purchase a firearm at a federal firearms licensee. You have to certify if you've got a domestic violence conviction, if you're a felon, if you have any one of a number of other prohibiting factors before you are going to make this attempt to purchase the firearm. Do you know if the state of West Virginia has such a law that prohibits someone from lying in their efforts to purchase a gun?
I don't.
Do you know if the state of West Virginia has any law that would prohibit the unlawful shipment or transfer or receipt of firearms that move in interstate commerce?
I don't know of any law.
Do you know if we have on the books in the state of West Virginia the equivalent of what federal prosecutors call a 924C, which is the use or possession of a firearm while engaged in drug trafficking?
I don't know of any such law in West Virginia.
And finally, and this is going to be pretty obvious because of the title, short title of this statute, but do you know if we have anything on the books in West Virginia that would prohibit using or carrying or possessing a firearm during the commission of a federal crime of violence?
I don't know of any such law in West Virginia.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate your help. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further questions of council? Seeing none, is there a discussion? Senator Marion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to hear from somebody from law enforcement, please.
Do you have a
At the appropriate
specific?
time. I ask unanimous consent.
Senator from Marion asked for unanimous consent for someone in law enforcement to address the committee today. Don't Don't everyone hop up at once. Welcome.
Afternoon.
If you will, please state your name and who you are here to represent for the committee.
My name is Chad Napper, and I work for AHIDA, which is Appalachia HIDA, which represents West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia.
Okay. If you will, please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to present today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Senator from Marion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chad, thank you for being here today. So I assume in your work, you work with different agencies on drug trafficking issues and what have you. Is that correct?
I do. I worked 20 years in law enforcement. I retired from the Charleston Police Department, and I spent 16 of 20 years in plainclothes working in drug units, ran the Metro Drug Unit. And now I work for Appalachia HIDA, which funds drug units throughout the United States. In particular, we fund drug units in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia.
Okay, Chad, I guess first of all, I want to hear your thoughts on
Yes,
this bill, and then I have some specific questions I'd like to run by you.
Okay.
So if you could just be brief to the committee and tell us how you feel about this piece of legislation we're discussing today.
Well, first and foremost, I want to say I support the Second Amendment. You know, I'm one in law enforcement, 20 years doing drug work. I would never go take anybody's guns from them that are law-abiding citizens. I support the intent of the bill, but I just don't want to hurt drug task forces throughout West Virginia. That's what I worry. I worry that, you know, that the unintended consequences from this is going to shift funds from West Virginia and my own agency to Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And I love those states, but I also know that we fund 15 initiatives in West Virginia. $2.4 million is dedicated this year just for drug units in West Virginia. And that's in the 15, you know, the 15 HIDA counties that's actually within Appalachia HIDA. We also have 3 counties that are in the Washington-Baltimore HIDA, which will be affected. So I worry about the unintended consequences from this bill is what I worry about.
So you talked about funding. Do you feel that funding for HIDA could be in jeopardy if this piece of legislation would become law?
This is what I worry about. You know, right off the bat, you have, if you pass this legislation, right off the bat, you have Huntington Drug Task Force in the worst hit community in West Virginia who will be out of compliance immediately with the Office of Drug Control Policy. As soon as you pass it, they will be out of compliance. Does that mean they're going to lose funding? No. I'm going to be straight up with you on all my answers. Okay? What they have to do then, I have a gentleman I was speaking to from Wyoming County. You're the 119 Task Force who, I'm from Boone County, so I'm very partial with obviously down south and those guys also. You get a waiver every year, okay, because you're in a rural community, okay? So every year when you put your application in to get funding for 119, you get a waiver that's given to you. Now that waiver is strict and it tells you apply for it every year and it's got to be extenuating circumstances, and you get that because you're a rural county, okay? So it's hard to get a federal agency to cooperate and come down and be a part of 119. It's not impossible, but it's hard. Huntington is not a rural community, so as soon as you pass this, they're going to be out of compliance. I worry that ONDCP will not grant that compliance for them. They could, but I worry that they won't. Okay, that's the first task force I know that's going to probably be affected, that's going to have to seek a waiver that's not in a rural community. The second ones I worry about is I know that the U.S. Attorney's Office are saying they are concerned with this bill. I don't know what that means. I don't know, you know, I don't know their thought process, but if you're saying you're concerned and you're not going to prosecute, this could be far reaching, okay? We're concerned and we believe that this is going to be hard for us to argue, and the defense attorney is going to bring it up every case. So when you bring a drug case along with a gun, a felon in possession, then we're not going to take those cases from multi-jurisdictional task forces because we just don't want to argue it. I don't think they'll do that, but I hope they won't, you know, because that's every task force. You know, then your federal agencies say, why are we involved with these task forces if we're involved with you and we're working the case with you and we can't get it prosecuted in state court? So if that happens, every task force has to have a federal agency involved, or they have to have that waiver. My boss, who is Vic Brown, who's the director in Kentucky, he says, listen, I'm very concerned, and I'm concerned for West Virginia. I'm not concerned for Kentucky, because we have 44 initiatives. We can shift the money, but there's no guarantee that money's going to come back to West Virginia. You know, so I know there's 29 other initiatives outside of West Virginia that would love to have it, I just always want to put West Virginia first, and I want to get all the funds we can here. That doesn't mean it'll happen. Maybe you all pass this and none of that happens, but that's concerns I have, because then we're putting the ball, in DCP's court instead of your all's court, as far as them giving us waivers. And so I'm afraid we're smacking them, and they're going to say, okay, we give Logan a waiver. We've given you a waiver for 5 or 6 years, and we tell you this is a yearly thing. You don't get a waiver. If you don't get a waiver, I can't give you funds. You see what I'm saying? So that's what worries me, between, just the bill and the way it's written. But I really, if you look at the legislative findings, and I'd love for somebody to explain it to me, on page 2, and under E, it says, entangling state and local agencies with federal law enforcement programs diverts already limited resources and blurs the lines of accountability between local, state, and federal governments. That goes completely against our mission statement at HIDA. We're trying to get funds to you, but we are a federal program. We bring the funds here, and you know who decides how these funds are used? We have federal, state, and local chiefs, sheriffs, who make the decisions on how those funds go into your communities, the U.S. attorneys in those communities. It's not federal, it's not DA, it's not FBI, it's not ATF, it's not our representatives. It is the people that are out there in the communities that are deciding where that money goes and how it's spent. So, that worries me when that's one of your legislative findings. That comes straight out of HIDA, that we work together, we share resources. We are a full force multiplier. We don't take away from each other. I spent 20 years doing drug work. We have to have our federal partners. We have to. So I get what it's trying to do, but I really worry about the bill.
So your concerns, and
Yes.
I want to be clear about that. These are concerns. Do you believe this could lead to federal agencies pulling out a joint task force if your concerns come to fruition?
I don't know what ONDCP is going to do. That's what worries me.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I don't know what ONDCP is going to do. The Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's who we administer the grants for. If they take it, you're smacking them. What are they going to do? I don't know. That's the big question, is if the director comes in and says, we're not giving you that waiver, we're not giving Huntington the waiver, and the other places that have waivers, and people start pulling out, we can't get those waivers, we can't give you funds. And like I said, that don't break a lot of people's hearts, because those funds can be shifted. All day long, Nashville just got approved. Nashville is a HIDA county. Nashville's getting $500,000 just for one agency. They could use the funds. But I want the funds here in West Virginia, because I've got a chief here who will tell you, and I've spent my 16 years with the Metro Drug Unit and DEA, that'll tell you he will not run the Metro Drug Unit. He's the lead agency. He will shut it down if you don't get HIDA funds. He can't. The funds are too tight. He cannot run the Metro Drug Unit, and that's your biggest agency that we fund. And I know I ran it for 4.5 years. I couldn't run it without HIDA funds. There's no way. So that's what I worry about, is do you want to shut them down, guys? We're in the middle of a huge drug epidemic. And Huntington right now is, to be honest with you, they spend as much time doing violent crimes as they do anything else, just because of the shootings that happened down there and the Detroit people. I worry about shutting some of them down, because I just don't think we have the funds to be able to keep them afloat.
Chad, I appreciate your candor and your honesty. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have for Chad right now, but at the appropriate time when this witness is done, I would like to also talk to somebody from local law enforcement, maybe FOP or somebody like that. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you guys for your time.
You might not want to leave. They may not be done with you.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, Mr. Napier, please, we have a few other lights on.
Sorry.
I'm going to call on the senator from Lewis. Questions of our guest?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you said it was Chad?
Chad.
Okay, thank you, Chad. Thanks for being here. Can you tell me what IDA stands for?
HIDA stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area.
Okay.
The Office of National Drug Control Policies, they approve counties within the state that not only have the resources to try to tackle the drug problem, but it's got to affect other areas of the country. So maybe you have, and that's hard to do in West Virginia, because we're the end of the food chain. When drugs come here, they don't go to another state generally. But, we can show that a lot of times the drug trafficking organizations, they're concentrating on West Virginia because they know we're in the middle of an opioid epidemic, and they know there's a lot of money here. So it's got to affect other parts of the country.
So with some of these states, and a little bit off topic, but just to kind of compare, some of these states have legalized certain drugs. If it's marijuana, I think Oregon had said that they were legalizing, even harder drugs. Have they lost any of their IDA funds because of that?
You know, there's a saying goes, and if you've seen one HIDA, you've seen one HIDA, and we're Appalachia HIDA, so I don't really know about their funds and how they're distributed. I mean, I know it's an executive board, but I don't know if they've shifted funds because of that.
Okay, but you are familiar, like,
Yes.
with what Oregon has done?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I don't know if you work with anybody that would maybe know that answer or not, because, you know, if we could kind of compare, I don't know if that makes sense or not, if, you know, if they've gone directly against the federal government on saying, hey, we're going to legalize these drugs, or we're going to decriminalize them, pretty much the same philosophies in this. I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, I think I think the philosophies are a little different in that, you know, there's nothing in program guidance that covers that, and there is stuff in program guidance that covers everything we're talking about here, seeking waivers and being very stringent on waivers, trying to get them not sought every year, and West Virginia is allowed to have that exemption because we're so rural, you know, so I think there's a difference there.
Okay.
And you know, the executive boards, they're governed by those program guidance.
So I think of in my area, there's like Mountain Lakes Drug Task Force.
Yes, sir.
Is that very similar to what we're talking about?
It is, but it's not a HIDA task force.
Okay.
It's just not in Haida County.
Okay. The IDA grants that we do receive, is it just the Wyoming and Huntington, or where would some of those be?
You have 15 initiatives throughout West Virginia, and those task forces are spread out. You have MDENT, which is in Kanawha County. You have West Virginia DEA, which is in Charleston. It really covers the whole state and, well, the whole southern part of the state. You have Greater Harrison, which covers Harrison County. Like I said, 119 covers down south. You have Southern Regional Drug and Violent Crimes, which covers the Bluefield area.
Okay.
You have Mon Metro covers Morgantown. Ohio covers Wheeling. You have Hancock, Brook, Weirton, which covers up in that panhandle.
Okay.
Marshall County.
What kind of funding would these task force receive from the federal government?
What they receive, and I'm very proud to say this, every one of our task forces, we fund directly to the individuals to get overtime. There's not a lot that do that. We give $18,000 a year per guy for overtime. So we cover the majority of their overtime for their whole year. We also cover buy money, we do training, and we give them equipment.
What kind of dollar amount?
Well, like the Metro Drug Unit, roughly they'll get around, I would say, $220,000 to $250,000 this year from HIDA.
Okay.
They're a larger task force. I would say, looking at 119, they're smaller, and Huntington, who I say directly affects, is about $100,000.
Okay. So one of the reasons why I asked that is like Greater Harrison, I have Harrison County in my district. Most of those charges that are brought on those individuals are brought by the federal prosecutor, not the state, or is that not correct?
Well, HIDA, you know how it is. When you accept funds, you're going to get some direction. And one of the things that HIDA Task Force do is they are in charge of dismantling and disrupting drug trafficking organizations and money laundering organizations. So they're not that lower level. They're mid to upper level drug investigations. And Greater Harrison is a great example that they do some great cases. I mean, you saw here recently the lady's body who was chopped up and put in a dumpster, and, you know, a drug trafficking organization out of Atlanta was up here. You know, that was a great case that got national attention, and one case after another. I know they seized 20-some pounds on an oil rig worker of meth. A lot of these times you don't hear about what's going on with these drug units because they're further in the case and it's not in the media, but they're doing some really good work.
Right. One just kind of follow-up question on, I believe that there was some discussion about putting an amendment in on the bill to make it to where you all would feel comfortable. Is that something you're familiar with, or no?
We would be great with an amendment. I mean, like I said, we're not, to me, is we agree with what you're trying to do. We just don't want to hurt, obviously, law enforcement and our partners while we're doing it.
Okay. Because when we talked about, you know, and I appreciate everything y'all do, and I do believe that you're pro-Second Amendment, but when we talk about law-abiding citizens and some of these laws that might be coming down from the federal administration or down from the federal government, that, you know, that maybe some of us believe is unconstitutional, then at that point they're not becoming a law-abiding citizen anymore because they're going directly against the federal government.
Yes, sir.
So how do we balance that out in an amendment?
Well, I mean, I was praying for y'all, because this is not easy. I mean, trying to figure out, and you're not going to satisfy everybody. I realize that. I don't know. That's something you all get paid the big bucks for. So you're all going to have to figure that out. But we want to work with you. We don't want to work against you. We really do. And the guys here that are representing, the side that they're bringing it up, we see why they're bringing it up. But we want to work with them too. It's kind of like the concealed weapons permit. We were against that, and they think we're Second Amendment. The reason I was against that is because now I can't take the gun from the dope dealer out on the street that's hiding it under his pants because he ain't got his dope on him. That's the only reason we were against it, is it took a tool away from us. So we want to work with you, but please don't smack us, because it's already hard enough being in law enforcement. I got a 22-year-old, 23-year-old son that just graduated from WVU, and he's now on Charleston PD. I worry for him. I really do in the times we live in, but I'm very thankful I live here in West Virginia, where it's very reasonable.
Yeah, well, I do appreciate everything you all do, everything law enforcement does, and I definitely appreciate you being here and answering my questions. So
Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Junior Senator from the 8th.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't mean to keep you. First off, thank you for being here today,
Thanks, sir.
and clearly you're passionate, you're informative, you're informed on the issues, and you're passionate about what you speak about. And I'm not aware of any amendment, but one of the issues that I see with the bill is, I think that obviously is the funding aspect, but I mean, and you kind of mentioned it before, I imagine whether it's the drug task force or any other objective, that the federal and state law enforcement rely upon each other, work together, and this would somehow cause a problem in that regard, right? Or
Yeah, it could cause a huge divide, especially obviously with ATF. I mean, that's the one that seems to be targeted more than any other. But you also, as I said before, I worry about what the U.S. Attorney's Office does, which could cause a further divide. I don't know, and it could be nothing.
for someone who, again, I'm not in law enforcement, so you mentioned, like, for example, force multiplier. So
Yeah.
can you give this committee an example where the coordination between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement achieves its goals in protecting the public, or apprehending a bad guy, or shutting a criminal organization down? Can you just give me an example, something I can?
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. Generally when we, as a drug unit, you're targeting those DTOs, those drug trafficking organizations. Here recently, within the last 2 years, they took the Central Regional Drug Task Force, which was down in Fayette County, worked with the FBI, who did a wire. Generally, your wires are done with your federal partners, your wire investigations, your Title III. Because one, they have the resources. Two, they're generally written federal. Not that you can't do state, but there's not been many state wires. So they did a wire which encompassed all of southern West Virginia and took down about 15 or 20 people that, in my opinion, this is just my opinion because I've done it for a long time. I was dealing with the guy when I was on the Metro Drug Unit, and very dangerous, very violent. They took him down in that wire, which otherwise would have been very hard to do. He was very smart, educated. He knew how to run the gamut, had been doing it for 20 years, and took down 15 or 20 people just because you have that federal partner, the FBI. It ended up touching DEA. It ended up touching the Metro Drug Unit, Fayette County. It ended up touching ATF. Everybody working together, and that's what it's about. We can't divide because, if you're saying, like when I read the findings there, and it says that it limits resources and it causes problems. I mean, you're saying that the $2.4 million that we bring to West Virginia, I'm a federal program, we are, that's causing problems. No, that's getting people to work together. That's getting people at the table. So they done things that we couldn't do, as one agency. Brent Webster, when I worked at Charleston PD, he talked about doing away with the Metro Drug Unit at one time because there's a lot of things behind it, and he said, we'll just have a Charleston Drug Unit. And he was talking to me on the phone, and at the time I was a sergeant. I said, Brent, you just don't understand. The first case we're going to go outside of Charleston, the very first case, we can go outside the state. We can go to Mexico, but we have to have these federal partners to do it. And that may sound funny, but if you go back and look at the case when I was at the Metro Drug Unit and DEA worked it, we extradited a guy from Mexico and brought him up after we'd seized approximately 3,000 pounds of marijuana, I believe it was 22 kilos of coke, and a Cessna airplane. $500,000. That's because we have federal partners. We couldn't have done those things alone. And we do dream big. We want to go to Colombia. We want to go to Mexico, but we can't do that without our federal partners.
And this piece of legislation jeopardizes that type of coordination that protects the public and secures the public.
This piece has potential.
Okay.
I'm not going to say, I'm saying it because I don't know how they're going to react, guys. I really don't. I don't know how ONDCP is going to react. It may go fine and we just lose our ATF partners with what you have here. We're going to lose ATF. We're not going to be able, what you have, we're not going to be able to work with them. Tyke, who has NIBRs that does DNA for gun casings, we're not going to be able to work with them. Those resources like that are going to hurt. Is it going to hurt all the others? I don't know, but I do worry.
Sure.
It may be fine. It may go through and we say, boy, we escaped there. But it may be next week my boss is saying, Chad, you don't have 2.4 million. Now you got 1 million. Do what you...
I'm sorry. I'm talking over you.
No, I shouldn't be talking over you.
No. And when you say that with this piece of legislation, you'll lose ATF, I would imagine that state and local law enforcement rely heavily on ATF.
We do. We do.
Absolutely.
Anytime, the first thing you do is when you go over to Steve Lowe at the U.S. Attorney's Office and you take an obliterated serial number with a gun, or you take a sawed-off shotgun, you take a felon in possession, he says, get with the ATF, work this case with them. That's the first thing he says. So we do the work. We take it to them. They shoot the gun. They write a report, and then we get them prosecuted for 5 years. Okay, you all say prosecute that in state court. Our state prisons are filled. Felon in possession, tell me if I'm not wrong, is it a misdemeanor? Guys, it's just, I mean, it's nice to say that, but the only federal ballgame we have is federal court. That's our federal ballgame. That's where you get your bang for your buck. That's where our communities are made safe because we don't have violent offenders out there shooting up our towns. We know that I'm not putting down state court, but our prisons are filled, and if we get a felony in state court and the individuals never go to prison, we're high-fiving because we know we're going to get them in federal court where they're going to be prosecuted.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you. That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Still a couple more questions. Senator from Ohio.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chad, you've been very humble in talking about your background. You were one of the best drug task force officers I've ever seen or worked with. Your time at MDENT, you made a tremendous impact. So I want to tap into that experience that you had working on the streets, on the front lines, and ask you this. And I know you've read the bill because you've talked about it. This bill tries to draw a very fine line and tries to separate some of this drug task force work from federal firearms violations. And you heard me ask council some questions about federal gun laws where we don't have a correlating state gun law. If you could, talk about the relationship between drug trafficking and firearms, and if it was a common occurrence for you on the front lines to come across a firearm when you were investigating someone who was involved in drug trafficking, whether it was a traffic stop, a search warrant, or otherwise, number one. And number two, talk about how much it helps a prosecutor when someone who's dealing drugs is found to have a firearm in his possession, and what that means for a case when you take it to federal court.
Well, you know, when you look at federal courts, you can have a small amount of drugs, but if you have somebody that's a convicted felon in their possession of a firearm, that's going to be a 5-year sentence. You know, so a lot of times they will take those cases. Say you got 1 gram of heroin, but you have that firearm. They'll take that case, and generally those will be pled very quickly, and we're happy with a 5-year plea to a felon in possession. To whereas in state court, we know it's a misdemeanor to have that gun, you know, with the heroin. And generally we know firearms go with drug cases. That's just the way it is. A lot of times, me at the Metro Drug Unit, if I have somebody, we'll ask, hey, do you have a gun for sale? That'll get us in, you know, or we'll try to trade. It isn't always the case. Most of the time it's about drugs first, but when we go serve those search warrants or we're doing traffic stops, generally those guns are present because they've got to protect what they have, and not only that, to protect themselves. Think about a dope dealer. I feel sorry for these young kids. They get into dealing drugs, and next thing you know, they are violent because they don't have any choice. If you're going to deal drugs, there's people going to try to take your stuff, steal you, rob, kill, and it changes who they are, and it makes them a lot more violent than I think they intended when they got into it themselves. So you can't talk about one without talking about the other. You can't just with drugs. As you know, our state is known for guns. I'm proud of that. I'm not something I'm ashamed of. But we also know that while drugs come here, our guns leave, right? Our Michigan crew, they come down here to get the guns to take them back. But a lot of times that'll be a case that we like to get involved with. And generally we just pass information and let ATF work it.
So guns are very common with drug dealers because they need to protect themselves and they need to protect their product.
Correct.
And their cash.
Yeah.
It's a cash-intensive business that they engage in, and they need to protect all of that. Second question, Chad, is this. You talked about the $2.4 million that flows from the Appalachia-Haida to the initiatives throughout the state, and each initiative gets so much money depending upon its size. You said that part of that money is for buy money. Can you talk about perhaps a bigger case, a case where you might go out of state, out of country, and that drug task force, in order to keep the case going, needs additional funds? The buy money in the original budget isn't enough to make the purchase from the large supplier. Is there an ability to go to the Appalachia-Haida and ask for some additional funds, some discretionary funds to keep that case going?
There is case specific. We will grant funds, especially for wire cases, but also generally every year we give $20,000 buy money to each task force. I have never seen my director turn down any time they've came back and asked for additional money. The Metro Drug Unit alone, on average, and I'm estimating here, I've been retired since 2015, but while I was there, we spent about $75,000 to $80,000 a year around there on buy money. So it takes a lot more than that, but I've never seen my boss say no to giving any of the task forces more buy money or specific buy money on a large case. Because if you go out now and start buying, a kilo of cocaine is going to cost you $30,000. I'm probably off. It's probably a little higher than that. But most of these task forces can't afford to do that.
So drug task forces can operate without buy money, correct?
That's correct.
And the local departments that make up these task forces, and I think of the one I spent the most time with in Wheeling. The city of Wheeling doesn't have money in their budget to fund the drug task force to make one of those big buys, does it?
That's correct. And I go back to MDIT because that's where I spent my career. When I was there, you got the $18,000 from HIDA, and then generally whatever overtime you spent beyond that, because I always, as a lieutenant, used mine by October. Charleston PD would supplement. They no longer do that. They don't have it in their budget. They really can't do it. I mean, they will they'll try to find it if it's case specific, but it used to be it was unlimited. We could spend. It's not like that. Agencies just don't have the money now.
And finally, Chad, these task forces, you talked about some cases that aren't directly related to guns or drugs. They're related to crime in the community. Do you agree with me that the task force has sort of its finger on the pulse of the community, and when there's a major homicide or some other kind of a major crime, that typically the drug task force has a good idea as to who might be involved because of all of the connections it has made in interviewing people, talking to sort of the underbelly of the community?
Yes, they have a very good pulse, and that's why I say with Huntington is, we know with the violent crime that's going on there that they're dealing a lot with guns and shootings, and that's going back to drugs and DTOs, but a lot of times it's not so much the dope they're putting on the table, it's taking that violent offender off, and we know that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Napier. We have one more light on the Senator from Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You may not be the correct person to answer. I wanted to ask some questions about how federal law and state law line up with relation to firearms. Is that something you would be knowledgeable about?
May have some, but there's definitely individuals here, and I know Brian Perkey's online. He's been dealing with it a lot more than I have. I could try if you want to ask. I'll be humble and tell you I don't know if I don't.
Well, I was interested in like the National Firearms Act and how those rules line up with state law.
I'm not sure, sir.
Okay, at Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time, I'd like to come back. Thank you.
All right. Seeing no further questions, Mr. Napier, thank you for joining us today.
Appreciate it.
There was a unanimous consent request. Was that Junior Senator from the 8th had that? Oh, that's right. Yeah. Senator from Marion asked for unanimous consent for a member of the Fraternal Order of Police to join the committee. Welcome. If you will, please state your name and your title for the record.
My name is Adam Crawford. I'm the Vice President of the West Virginia Fraternal Order of Police.
Mr. Crawford, will you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that your testimony before the committee today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir.
Senator from Marion.
Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. I guess I just want to hear your thoughts on how you believe this could impact public safety and/or the ability to investigate and prevent drug crimes, or any kind of crimes.
Well, Chad did an outstanding job of kind of laying the groundwork.
I want to hear it more on a local level. That's why I wanted.
Right. So, yeah, I'm a detective. Those are my primary duties for the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office in Charleston, and In doing that, we investigate a lot of violent crimes. When we are investigating these crimes, during the course of those investigations, a lot of times we uncover evidence and are able to develop good cases as far as federal firearms violations go. And it may come to a point where our U.S. Attorney's Office may want to adopt that case because that may be the best route to take that case as far as getting the violent criminal off the street. There are different variables that go into it. It may be tougher to prove the state charge. There may be more stiffer penalty with a federal firearms violation. So we have these partnerships with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with our task forces, our violent crimes task forces throughout the state. And we're all trying to work together to try to get the best outcome to get violent criminals off the street. I mean, that's our job as police officers. For us, it's about keeping the community safe. I echo what Chad said, and the FOP does too. We are for the Second Amendment. We do not want to infringe on people's Second Amendment rights, period. We don't want to do it. Where we have concerns are the fears of the federal overreach that I'm sure we're all familiar with. We all have the same concerns, I would think. But all that has been mixed in with the resources and the tools that we already have to be able to put these violent criminals away. And that's the concern from law enforcement. It's about putting violent criminals away. And those are my concerns. Those are some concerns that we have discussed amongst several different law enforcement organizations. On top of that, with the way Chad put it, as far as laying out the funding issues that could come about it, I mean, that's obviously, it takes, to try not to make things like this about money, but to get people behind bars, it costs money to do. It costs resources. And the resources that we may lose, that's another fear that I have. Chad mentioned NIBIN. Are you all familiar with what NIBIN is? It's the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. And in essence, what that does, it's a program that's run by the ATF, actually. And if we have shootings and we are able to get firearms evidence, with shell casings or bullets, we can input those shell casings into NIBIN. And what it does is it creates a database. It's like a fingerprint for a shell casing, more or less. And we can accumulate that data. Well, say we have a rash of shootings here in the Charleston area, and then 6 months down the road, a gun gets located on an individual in Huntington. And we're able to tie that firearm to some shootings that happened in Charleston. I mean, it's all about the resources and collaboration that Chad spoke about, that we all, the state and local, our federal partners, we all bring something different to the table, and we all just want to work together to try to get violent criminals away. And we're open to try to work this thing out and try to get something to where we get the best of both worlds, per se. We're able to preserve our Second Amendment rights, but also we're able to still use all the tools and resources that we have available to put violent criminals away. And that's the stance that I have and that the FOP has.
As they say, it takes a village. But I just have one more question, and then I'll relinquish the mic here. Was your agency or any other law enforcement agency that you know of involved in the drafting of this piece of legislation? Were you consulted in any way while this was being drafted?
On House Bill 2694,
Yes.
sir? Not on the House side, sir, no.
Not on the House side? Is that what you said?
No, not with 2694, no.
Thank you.
We had some discussions about another bill in the Senate side.
I'm talking about this bill particularly.
No, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have for this witness.
Thank you. We have another question from Senator from Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here. One of my questions was related to, and maybe we had heard the gentleman before maybe say that you guys don't know about the funding, if you guys are going to lose the funding or not. And I know that we'd maybe talked previously, and there was some discussion that, if there was a task force related to drugs and firearms and many different things, that you might not lose those resources. But you're saying that it's just the unknown, that if you will lose those resources?
Yeah, I mean, we only know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. I mean, I know that like I mentioned, NIBIN, that is a program that's run by the ATF, and that is something that we use to help solve violent crimes, and there are other avenues as well. It's the funding as well as the resources, the investigative tools and resources that we have as well.
And you were talking about in the House that some folks had testified that that was not the case, that that you all would not lose your funding?
Yes, there was a House committee meeting, and there was some discussion about whether it would or would not affect federal funding.
Okay. Who spoke to that it would not affect the federal funding?
Those were the committee members discussing it.
Okay, so no one directly from the federal government or anybody from law enforcement. You're just saying just the members?
Yes.
Okay, and the gentleman that drafted the legislation, I know that the gentleman from Marion was asking you if you guys had any involvement at all. Did you guys discuss the bill with him and your concerns?
With who, sir?
I believe, who is the lead sponsor on this? I believe that Delegate Steele was the one that had written the legislation up. Did you have discussions about him with what the bill did after he had written the legislation?
So there was a Senate bill, 353, that from what I remember, it mirrored 2694 pretty closely. And we actually had a stakeholders meeting in this room to try to get some of both sides' concerns addressed and discuss hopefully an outcome that would please both sides. 353 didn't move over here. 2694 was introduced. I don't know at what point or when that was, but we did have discussions about Senate Bill 353. That's why I was asking specifically about which bill that they were talking to.
Okay, so once that bill was introduced and when it went before the committee, did you have discussions with the sponsor?
I didn't have a discussion with the sponsor. We went to the committee meeting and discussed our concerns in front of the committee.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator from Cabell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you being here, and I'm certainly a gun owner and killed my first squirrel when I was 10 and all those stories that we all share here. But I'm getting a lot of emails from constituents that this will defund the police. Can you give an estimation on the likelihood that the funding will be in jeopardy if this passes into law?
Well, Chad can speak to that a lot better than I can just because of his experience and his current position. But it's definitely a fear that we have, that we could lose federal funding and resources. It's just unknown.
Thank you, sir.
Junior Senator from the 8th.
Just to follow up on the senator from Cabell's statement, and I know, no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. I could walk out on the street and get hit by a bus, but as far as your fear, I assume that's based upon your education, your experience, and coordinating between the federal and state levels, and working with officers, and everything that you do, whether it's drug, HIDE, or anything else, ATF. So your concern is well established based upon all of that experience and your education in regard to law enforcement, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Senator from Ohio.
Just at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman, there's another witness I wanted to call. I just didn't want to forget to mention that to you.
All right, at the appropriate time. Senior Senator from the 8th, question of our guest. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crawford, thank you for being here and all the officers here. Appreciate what you guys do and very thankful. I just got one question. Everyone's asked just about everything. I don't know what else could be asked. So you say Senate Bill 353, y'all were involved with it?
Yes, sir.
And
well, we had discussions about it.
You had discuss and can you give me your thoughts on 353?
Which
Senate Bill 353.
There were, like I said, it closely resembled 2694. The original draft of 353 had a criminal penalty for law enforcement officers for doing these investigations. So we had obviously had some concerns over that, and we discussed that. There was a proposed committee substitute on 353 that was discussed. We were good with that committee substitute on 353, and it never moved into committee. So 2694 started moving over in the House side, and then it went through House Judiciary, and then obviously came over here, and now it's in this committee. So that's kind of how that process went.
So Senate Bill 353, there was some massaging, I'm gonna call it massaging with the bill that you guys were comfortable with, that would have been in the form of a committee substitute.
Yes, sir, there was.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Crawford, seeing no further questions, I appreciate you joining our committee today.
All right, thank you.
Actually, the Senator from Mercer, you have a question to council?
Yes, I have a question to council. Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to the question to council. Senator from Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Phil, I think we started out talking about apples, and all of a sudden we're talking about oranges. And I'd like a little bit of clarification. I'm assuming that the sponsors of this bill were trying to resolve the problem of the federal people coming in and taking guns away from West Virginians. And all the lines I see in this bill as I read it, it refers to taking away, cooperating with a federal agency for the sole purpose of taking away guns. Doesn't say anything about cooperating with federal agencies for drug issues or any other crime. Everything I found in this bill, and I read it very quickly, says that the lack of cooperation is defined as strictly if the target is to take away a gun. No other crimes are referenced. Can you help split that hair for me and tell me what it really says rather than what people think it says?
In my interpretation, there is a carve out on it's on page 5, section, line 50 down to the next section. That says that it does not stop law enforcement from conducting enforcement or investigative duties associated with a joint law enforcement task force, including sharing of confidential information, so long as the primary purpose of the joint law enforcement task force is not federal firearm law enforcement, and the enforcement investigative duties are primarily related to violation of state or federal law and related to federal firearm law enforcement. So the interpretation would be, and again, I mean, I believe that everybody who's testified here has testified that there's an unknown factor here. The way that I think from a council's perspective, if the task force was for something, primarily for something other than firearms, such as drugs, then this would not fall afoul of it automatically.
It sounds like you said it the same way I was trying to interpret it, that this lack of cooperation, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm getting a little bit fuzzy with the language here, but this bill only refers to taking guns away from somebody because they are not within the federal guideline of a legal gun rather than the state. But one of the first statements made was this: if we pass this bill, cooperation with ATF's out. But the ATF doesn't go looking for guns, they go looking for drugs. And if there are guns in the same place where the drugs are, that's okay. Have I expressed that correctly?
With all due respect, I believe that the ATF is primarily focused on firearms, and I think it's typically the DEA that would be
Okay, so
guns.
the ATF
or
would
drugs,
be, okay. Well, that's kind of the clarification I'm trying to figure out of how to.
In fact, the ATF is specifically mentioned in this bill. On page, sorry.
But all the conversation about drug, that's not ATF, is it? Drug actions or activities? Or is it?
In the sense, I would let some of these law enforcement agents to go with that. It would not be my understanding that ATF is primary focus is drugs. That would not be my understanding, but again, there's people here that
Sounds
are
like two
more
different
equipped.
answers to the same question. Well, I think it's going to be very important in deciding what to do with this bill is to understand what it really says rather than what people are afraid it says. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's enough for me.
Thank you. Junior Senator from the 8th have a unanimous consent request? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll take care of the question of the council first. Senator from Cabell.
Council, I think my senator from Mercer was equally as confused as I was, because no disrespect, but I think you just gave two inconsistent answers. So what's the acronym ATF stand for?
The agency, I think, goes by the full name now: Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. So you're not telling us that their primary focus is drugs, are you?
No, Senator, I said that I do not believe that their primary focus is drugs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the best laws in my view, and we'll have this debate later, that exists in the whole country is that a felon is not allowed to have a firearm. Now, we could debate that. I think a lot of people want the felons, based on a vote we had yesterday, don't have a problem with a felon having a firearm. That's a policy decision. My question to you is, this bill, if the local law enforcement is involved in pursuing and arresting a felon in possession of a firearm, and that's only federal, that's not, the felony is only federal, am I right?
The felony is only federal. There is a
Misdemeanor, local, yeah, I get that. But if they want to get the felony charge on the felon in possession of a firearm, the law enforcement would be in a position where they're acting in contrary to this bill. Is that right?
if they were specifically pursuing, if it could be shown that they were specifically pursuing that individual in order to arrest them for felon in possession of a firearm on a federal level, in order to pass it off to the federal prosecutors, then yeah, that would be in violation of this law.
So what would the punishment of the policeman be if he or she was arresting solely motivated by getting this felon in possession of a firearm and turning him over to the federal government for the felony? What would the consequences on that officer be?
Unlike the introduced version of Senate Bill 353, there are no, nothing in this bill speaks to whether or not,
They couldn't
any
go to
penalties
jail.
involved.
We wouldn't put the policeman in jail for this, would we? Under the current iteration of the bill.
No, there are no penalties.
The introduced bill, I think, on the House side would have jailed the policeman, right?
Well, I've Senate Bill 353 here, the introduced version.
Now, this bill.
Of the introduced version, I'm sorry, I don't have the introduced version with me, but I believe, as stated, it's
I thought
substantially.
we were talking about a House bill.
I'm sorry?
I thought we were discussing a House bill.
We are discussing House
Well,
bills.
I don't care about the Senate bill. I want to talk about the House bill. Original version of the House bill would have put a policeman in jail, or, right?
If believe-
If he went after that felon with the firearm, right? And that was his sole purpose to get that guy off the street. That was in this original bill, right?
The original bill would have said, upon conviction thereof, fine not more than $1,000 or confined in jail for not less than 60 days.
And the policeman would have gone to jail, is that right?
Yes.
Well, why'd you hesitate? I keep hearing about how well intended, and I'm sure they are, the sponsors of this bill are. I guess that came out in committee over there, the part about putting the policeman in jail.
That's my understanding.
Thank you.
I've got a message from finance that they're wanting to start at 4 o'clock sharp, so we're already a minute past. I'm going to take a motion from Senator from Mercer.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recess until 15 minutes after the completion of Judiciary and Finance.
The motion is to recess. I will tell for anyone interested on the agenda, 2002 is a pretty heavy lift, so we will tackle it some other day, but we'll recess.